One number to start with, 2,330. That's how many Patriot missile interceptors the U.S. had in its stockpile before this war began, according to a new analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. That number is now estimated at somewhere between 759 and 827. Before we go any further, here's the correction this entire video needs to make right at the top. That stockpile collapse isn't Iran's. It's America's. The title you clicked on frames this as Iran's air defense is drying up, and that's exactly the kind of mix-up spreading across headlines right now. So let's fix it immediately and then walk through what the real report actually says, because the real version is arguably more significant than the mixed-up one. Let's get to framing right immediately. According to reporting published July 28th by the Washington Post, Fox affiliate coverage, and the Associated Press, a new CSIS analysis found that recent fighting with Iran has further drawn down the United States' own stockpiles of advanced air defense interceptors, specifically Patriot and THAAD systems, potentially putting American troops at greater risk if hostilities with Iran resume. That's the actual headline underneath the confusing title. This isn't a story about Iran's ability to defend its own airspace weakening. It's a story about America's ability to defend its own troops and bases weakening, worn down by the sheer volume of Iranian missiles and drones it's had to shoot out of the sky for 5 months straight. Here's how this is sourced, because a claim about depleted American weapon stockpiles deserves real receipts, not vibes. This draws on CSIS's own publicly released budget document-based analysis, reporting from the Associated Press's Ben Finley on the political dispute over these numbers, Business Insider's coverage of Patriot deployment specifics, an on-record comment from Joint Chiefs Chairman Dan Kane and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Where these sources overlap, I'll show you the overlap. Where the story is more complicated than a single number suggests, I'll walk through why. Let's trace the actual numbers over time, because the trajectory here tells you more than any single snapshot. CSIS estimated the U.S. Patriot interceptor stockpile stood at 2,330 before this war began on February 28th. By the time the first ceasefire took hold in April, that number had already fallen to roughly 1,030, a drop of more than half in about 5 weeks of the most intense fighting. Following the renewed fighting that's played out through this month, CSIS now estimates the stockpile sits somewhere between 759 and 827, a decrease of at least 65% from where it started. That's not a single dramatic depletion event. It's a steady, compounding drawdown across 2 separate phases of this war, each one eating further into a supply that CSIS warned back and may could take at least 3 years to fully replenish. 3 years for a system Israel and multiple Gulf partners are also drawing on to defend their own airspace at the same time American forces are using it. Why is this specific weapon system the one running short rather than everything across the board? Because Patriot and THAAD interceptors are the primary tools American and allied forces have used to shoot down Iranian ballistic missiles and drones throughout this entire conflict, and Iran has fired an enormous volume of both since February. It's worth being precise here, because there's a separate, easily confused number in this story that belongs to Iran, not the U.S., and conflating them is exactly how headlines like this one get garbled. Joint Chiefs Chairman Dan Kane told reporters that the number of ballistic missiles Iran itself was firing had fallen by 86% from the war's first day, a figure that reflects Iran's own diminishing offensive capacity, not America's defensive stockpile. Those are 2 different depletion stories happening on opposite sides of the same battle, and the CSIS report currently making headlines is specifically about the American side of that equation, the side absorbing all those Iranian launches with a finite supply of interceptors. There's a second layer here that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth addressed directly, and it shows the Pentagon has already been adjusting tactics in response to exactly this kind of shortage concern. Hegseth told reporters that American forces used more expensive standoff munitions, precision weapons launched from a distance, heavily at the start of the war while targeting Iran's early warning systems and air defenses, but said forces no longer need to rely on those as much now. Instead, he said, operations have shifted toward using 500-pound, 1,000-pound, and 2,000-pound GPS and laser-guided precision gravity bombs, weapons the U.S. has a healthier supply of, though they require aircraft to fly closer to their targets to deliver them, according to defense analyst Ryan Brobst. That's a real operational trade-off playing out in real time. Conserve the scarce, exquisite interceptor and standoff munitions, and accept more risk by flying closer with cheaper, more plentiful gravity bombs instead. CSIS's own analysis flagged the same dynamic from the defensive side, warning that shrunken Patriot and THAAD inventories may force American forces and their Middle Eastern allies to launch fewer interceptors per incoming threat to conserve stock, which by definition raises the odds that an Iranian missile or drone eventually gets through. Now here's where this becomes a genuinely contested political story, not just a number story. According to the Associated Press, Democrats in Congress have repeatedly cited this exact kind of stockpile depletion as a damning metric against a war that Trump launched without congressional approval alongside Israel back on February 28th. Their concern extends beyond just this conflict. Experts and lawmakers have raised worries that depleted American firepower here could leave the U.S. military with diminished readiness for a potential future conflict with China, a scenario that would draw on many of the same interceptor and munitions stockpiles currently being burned through defending against Iran. The Trump administration's public position has been consistently different. Trump himself posted that several defense contractors had agreed to quadruple production of weapons as rapidly as possible, though without detailing specifically which systems that applies to, and administration officials have repeatedly said American forces have all the weapons they need to continue the fight. Both of those things can be true at once without contradicting each other the way talks versus no talks did in our last breakdown. The military can genuinely have enough interceptors for its current operational tempo, while independent analysts simultaneously warn that the underlying stockpile has fallen to a level that constrains future options and would take years to rebuild. That's not a lie on either side. It's two different time horizons being described by two different groups with two different incentives. So here's the corrected, honest version of the story your title is pointing at. Iran's air defenses aren't the ones drying up in this specific report, and conflating the two countries' depletion stories is exactly how a headline like Iran's air defenses are drying up ends up misleading people about what a serious defense policy story actually says. What's genuinely drying up is the United States' own stockpile of Patriot and THAAD interceptors, down at least 65% from pre-war levels according to CSIS, with a 3-year-plus timeline to rebuild it, forcing real tactical trade-offs like relying more heavily on cheaper gravity bombs that require flying closer to target. Iran's separate decline, an 86% drop in its own missile firing rate since day one, is a real and significant story too. But it's a story about Iran's shrinking offensive capacity, not its defensive one, and it's not the same report or the same number as the one driving this week's American stockpile headlines. Keeping those two separate is the difference between actually understanding where this war's real pressure points are right now, and just repeating whichever version sounds scarier.